Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the radical students who used to, hurl firebombs at the government gates didn't just fade away into history.
Yeah, they didn't just disappear.
Right. Instead, they put on tailored suits, they passed the bar exam, and now they're sitting comfortably inside those very gates. They're actually writing the laws and shaping the culture.
It's like you thought the revolution was defeated, but it actually just moved into the boardroom.
Exactly. And that is exactly the reality a young journalist stumbled into in South Korea in the late 1990s. So today, we are going to explore how that happened in this deep dive.
It's a really incredible story.
It is. We're unpacking this fascinating piece from a Substack called Truth Hunter. The post is titled The Hidden Republic, and it's an adaptation of a real-world political memoir written by a South Korean journalist.
Someone who actually lived through this exact transition.
Right. And our mission today is to trace the mechanics of how a nation's true masters, the ideological architects, actually pulling the levers of power step out of the shadows.
It really forces you to completely rethink how institutional power is built. Not through elections, but through incredible patience and ideological discipline.
Absolutely. Now, before we dive into the timeline, I need to explicitly state something very important to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is key.
The source material we're exploring today deals with highly polarized, politically charged history in South Korea. It involves deeply entrenched left-wing and right-wing perspectives.
Very sensitive stuff.
Very. And I want to make it absolutely clear, we are not endorsing either side here. We're not validating these specific political viewpoints at all.
Right. Our goal is just to lay out the facts as they're presented.
Exactly. Our mission is to impartially unpack the fascinating structural mechanisms in the author's memoir.
That's a crucial distinction. We are basically acting as a lens to examine the author's lived experience.
Spot on. So to truly understand what he experienced, we have to look at the landscape of South Korea in 1998.
Right, so the country has just survived the absolute trauma of the IMF financial crisis.
Let's pause there for a second because, to a lot of listeners, IMF crisis might just sound like dry economic history.
Oh, it was way more than that.
Right. This wasn't just a regular recession.
Not at all. It was a devastating sovereign default. I mean, South Korea's economy essentially collapsed overnight.
Wow.
Yeah, the International Monetary Fund had to step in with this massive bailout, and the conditions of that bailout forced brutal corporate restructuring and mass layoffs.
So total upheaval.
Total. It was a profound national humiliation. You literally had everyday citizens donating their gold wedding rings to the government to help pay off the national debt.
Oh, wow. That really puts it into perspective.
Yeah, that's how deep the crisis went. But out of that chaos, new president Kim Dae-jung takes power.
Yeah.
And to the outside world, this looks like a triumph.
Like a peaceful democratic transition during an economic nightmare.
Exactly. But beneath the surface, there's this massive vacuum of institutional power. And a young journalist, still in his late 20s, realizes that a highly organized network of former radical students is just, quietly stepping into that vacuum.
And the most unsettling part of the author's story is that he didn't go looking for this underground network. They actually found him first.
Right, they came to him.
So to understand the hidden power structure this author is warning you about, we have to start at the flashpoint. The exact moment this shadow network was forced out into the blinding light.
Okay, let's unpack this.
In January 1999, a conservative monthly magazine called Wolgan Chosun published an explosive article.
And the fallout from that was massive.
Yeah, the author essentially describes it as a thought crime tribunal.
The controversy centered on a man named Professor Choi Jang-jip. Now, Professor Choi wasn't just some fringe academic,
Right, he was a big deal.
He was a highly respected scholar who had recently been appointed as a key advisor to the newly inaugurated president.
Okay, so he's right in the inner circle.
Exactly. And suddenly, Wolgan Chosun digs up his past writings and just hauls him into the public eye over his framing of the Korean War.
What did he say?
Well, he had written something that, from the perspective of the South Korean establishment, was completely radioactive. He referred to the Korean War as a historical decision by Kim Il-sung.
Oh, wow. Okay, to put that in perspective for an American listener, imagine a top history professor, someone who was just appointed to advise the White House, suddenly publishing a paper arguing that the British were the actual liberators in the American Revolution.
Yeah, and that George Washington was just an illegitimate rebel.
Exactly. It fundamentally inverts the moral reality of the country. But wait, hold on. I'm looking at this and thinking, wasn't the left's defense simply that this was, an alternative scholarly perspective?
Like a nuanced academic take?
Right, like a nuanced take on a liberation war. Why did a single academic paper escalate into a full-blown national crisis?
What's fascinating here is that both sides understood this was never just an academic dispute. The defenders of Professor Choi absolutely argue what you just said.
That it was just academic freedom.
Yeah, they claim the conservative magazine was weaponizing academic nuance and ripping quotes out of context to enforce right-wing ideological conformity.
I see.
But, as the source text argues, the real stakes were existential. This was a battle for the moral foundation of the state itself.
Because whoever controls the narrative of a nation's birth ultimately controls its future.
Exactly. The underlying logic is brutal but true.
Right. I mean, if you convince the public that the origin story of South Korea isn't a narrative of legitimate self-defense against a communist invasion, but rather a reactionary suppression of a people's revolution, the entire legitimacy of the state crumbles.
Yep. If the foundation is rotten, the house has to be torn down.
But why were the South Korean elite so primed to panic over this specific phrasing? To answer that, the author says we have to rewind the clock.
We have to go back 10 years to 1989.
Right, back to the exact environment where this ideology was incubated.
And that takes us straight to the campus of Seoul National University.
Which is essentially Korea's Harvard.
Right. But the picture the memoir paints is completely unrecognizable if you're imagining, like, quiet libraries and ivy-covered walls.
Yeah, it wasn't a place of academic detachment at all. It was a political theater.
A very intense one.
You had 18-year-old freshmen, including the author of this memoir, being thrust into these pre-dawn agitation sessions run by hardcore upperclassmen.
And the specific details the author provides are incredibly vivid. You have bookstores just off campus, private, capitalist enterprises, mind you, openly selling illegal Marxist texts.
Which is wild considering the era.
Yeah. We're talking about a time with strict national security laws where just possessing pro-North Korean literature could land you in prison.
But the institutional capture of the campus was so complete that nobody even bothered to hide it.
Exactly. During freshman orientation, students weren't doing, icebreakers. They were locking arms and singing 19th century European labor anthems.
And those anthems were heavily infused with a very specific militant brand of anti-American nationalism.
Right. And hanging over all of this was the 1980 Gwangju massacre.
Yeah, for context, in 1980, the South Korean military violently crushed civilian pro-democracy protesters in the city of Gwangju. It was a horrific tragedy.
It was awful. But for the students arriving a decade later, it wasn't just a sad historical memory to mourn.
The text explains that it was actively weaponized.
Exactly. It was presented as the ultimate proof that their own government was irredeemably evil and that the United States was complicit for letting it happen.
Right. Gwangju provided the moral justification for everything they did.
It really did. Returning seniors who had actually served prison time for their violent activism walked around the campus with this untouchable aura.
Like they were veterans of a holy war.
Exactly. The author lists names like Kim Se-jin, Lee Ja-ho, and the revered martyr Park Jong-keo. These weren't just guys living down the hall in the dorms.
No, the text describes them as the currency of a moral economy.
That's such a powerful phrase.
Think about the psychological impact of that on an 18-year-old. You leave home, you walk into the most prestigious university in the country, and the smartest, most respected people there are telling you that your country is a total lie.
That's completely overwhelming.
And the author reflects on his own assimilation into this culture. He says the freshmen absorbed all of this, not with critical distance, but with absolute awe.
The atmosphere and the radical ideology were delivered as one complete package. You didn't question it, you just got swept up in the current.
Now, listening to this, you might be picturing a massive, unified army of student radicals marching in lockstep, but the reality inside the walls of Korean progressivism was deeply fractured.
It was completely split.
Here's where it gets really interesting. By the time this generation reached their mid-20s, their intellectual landscape was dominated by two warring factions, the NL and the PD.
Right, and this ideological maze is crucial to understanding what happens later. Let's look at the NL faction first.
That stands for National Liberation.
Right. Yes. According to the source, their primary enemy wasn't actually capitalism. Their primary enemy was American imperialism.
Oh, interesting.
Their ultimate goal was the reunification of the Korean peninsula on terms that didn't require North Korea to fundamentally change.
Wow.
And crucially, they viewed the Korean War exactly the way Professor Choi's contested writings framed it, not as northern aggression, but as Minjo Hibang Jongjang.
Meaning a war of national liberation, which is wild because that framing matches Pyongyang's official state history almost verbatim.
It does. And then you contrast that with the PD, Faction People's Democracy.
Right, these were the classic textbook Marxists. They cared far less about North Korea as a model.
Yeah, they wanted to dismantle South Korea's capitalist structure from the inside, focusing heavily on labor movements and the working class.
And the memoir emphasizes that these two factions absolutely despised each other. I mean, they fought constantly over doctrine.
Oh, totally. Yet they shared the exact same campuses, they yelled the same protest chants, and they shared a total unifying contempt for the state they lived in.
Which brings up a glaring contradiction. If they both wanted a revolution and they both wanted to tear down the government, what was their actual plan for the day after the revolution?
Yeah, who runs the hospitals? How do the trains work?
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author points out that this is a classic hallmark of radical movements.
Right. While their enemies were incredibly vivid, the military, the Americans, the corporations, their utopian blueprints for the future were conspicuously empty.
Just totally blank.
What nobody was allowed to ask was what actually came next. The vision for a liberated Korea was just fog. They only knew how to destroy, they had no idea how to build.
But history doesn't wait for revolutionaries to figure out their blueprints. Fast forward to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. Eastern Europe unravels.
The Berlin Wall is gone.
Logically, this Marxist-adjacent revolutionary campus ideology in South Korea should have just died out. The global experiment failed.
It should have. But as the source reveals, the ideology didn't die. It mutated.
And that mutation is the most dangerous mechanism the author identifies.
Absolutely.
It's less like a biological virus and more like corporate restructuring. Think about it. When your core product, in this case Soviet-style Marxism or violent student revolution, goes totally bankrupt in 1991, you don't dissolve the company.
Right, you just rebrand.
You change the company name to human rights advocacy, you put a fresh coat of paint on the logo, but you keep the exact same board of directors.
That is exactly how the author describes it. They adopted an entirely new vocabulary.
Like what kind of vocabulary?
Well, suddenly, the language of violent revolution and proletariat struggle was completely replaced by the language of postmodernism, NGO activism, and civil rights discourse.
Ah, I see. Because to a mainstream voter, someone calling for equitable corporate reform sounds completely reasonable.
Exactly. But to the network, the underlying infrastructure, the personal networks, the deep loyalties, and the core anti-American pro-North goals remained exactly the same.
They just found a Trojan horse that the Democratic public would accept.
Yes, precisely.
But hold on, I'm struggling to buy the logistics of this. Are we really supposed to believe that thousands of students from warring factions secretly agreed to put on suits, pass corporate background checks, and perfectly execute a 30-year shadow conspiracy?
That sounds a bit like a movie, doesn't it?
Yeah. Isn't it more likely they just grew up, got mortgages, and sold out?
It's a completely fair question, and the author addresses it.
Yeah.
It wasn't some smoky backroom conspiracy with a master blueprint.
Okay, so how did it work?
It was a shared ideological framework combined with incredible network effects. Remember, these are the graduates of Seoul National University. They were undeniably brilliant.
Ah, right. The elite of the elite.
Yeah. And as South Korea rapidly democratized in the 1990s, there was a sudden, massive demand for lawyers, journalists, and civic leaders.
And these former radicals simply stepped into that vacuum.
They didn't have to announce a conspiracy. They just hired each other, cited each other, and promoted each other.
And the author describes watching this happen with sheer horror, because he had been inside that machine. He knew what these people actually believed in 1989.
He knew their true colors.
Exactly. And now, less than a decade later, he's watching them move without any friction into the commanding heights of South Korean society.
They are joining massive corporate law firms, taking over editorial boards at major newspapers, sitting on government advisory committees.
Leading highly funded civil society groups.
Yes. And they never renounced their revolutionary past. As the text puts it, they simply archived it.
Archived it. Wow.
Yeah, they packed it away in a mental box and waited for the institutions to become fully theirs.
It is a terrifyingly patient strategy. You build institutional power within a democracy by using the universally accepted language of that democracy.
All while harboring fundamental commitments that the Democratic majority never actually voted for.
Which brings us right back to our starting point in 1998 and 1999. The archived past is suddenly deployed in the real world.
The mask slips.
Yes. The Woolgan-Choson article drops, exposing Professor Choi's framing of the Korean War, and the fallout wasn't just a few angry letters to the editor.
No, it was a 30-day national firestorm.
The sheer scale of the reaction proved the author's point about how deeply this network had penetrated society.
The conservative Hankook Party demanded resignations. The largest conservative paper, the Chosun Ilbo, demanded accountability.
And you had military veterans associations clashing in the streets with dozens of newly formed, well-funded civic organizations defending the professor.
It was an all-out war over memory.
It really was.
Because the core battlefield, the debate over the start of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, wasn't about history at all. It was about power in the present.
Right. If the left could successfully legitimize the narrative that the war was an American-sponsored suppression of a people's revolution, they would rewrite the moral DNA of the country.
Precisely.
And the climax of this entire showdown in the source text is incredibly revealing about how the network operates. The Seoul District Court eventually issues a preliminary injunction against the conservative magazine,
Which actively prevents further publication of the contested article.
Think about the paradox there. The left celebrates this court-ordered censorship as a victory for academic freedom.
And the right cries foul, saying the legal system has been weaponized.
And the young journalist, sitting at his desk at the censored magazine, has this chilling epiphany. He realizes he hasn't actually escaped the ideological maze of his college years.
He just found a different door.
Yeah. The people who were running those pre-dawn agitation sessions in 1989 were now the lawyers filing the injunctions and the judges signing the orders in 1999.
The machine had fully integrated itself into the state.
So, what does this all mean? If we step back from the specific history of Seoul in the 1990s, the core concept the author is warning you about is the parallel state.
Right, it's a blueprint.
It's a blueprint of what happens when a highly organized network of true believers spends decades quietly building institutional power inside the formal structures of a democracy.
They use the democratic system to gain power, while fundamentally maintaining loyalties that the voting public never explicitly endorsed.
And this raises an important question. The Substack post makes a direct pivot to the reader.
In its FAQ section, it explicitly invites you to consider the broader implications.
Because the structural reality described in this Korean memoir, where an ideological network achieves massive institutional power without a decisive electoral mandate, is a matter of documented historical record there.
But the text asks, are similar mechanisms of institutional capture, driven by former campus radicals, happening in the United States or other Western democracies right now?
Are parallel states being built quietly in the background of your own institutions?
It really makes you look at the world around you differently.
It does. Think about how jarring it would be if you found out the senior editor of your morning newspaper or the judge deciding a major constitutional case still held the exact same worldview as their old college Marxist cell.
But now they just call it civic duty.
Exactly. The author showed us how revolutionaries hid their true goals behind universally accepted terms like NGO activism and human rights.
It's an incredibly effective camouflage.
It really is. And here's a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. If an ideological network successfully masks its radical endgame in the unquestionable, virtuous language of human rights and equity, how would a democratic society even possess the vocabulary to identify it?
Let alone challenge it. When the very words we use to defend our society are the ones being used to dismantle it, the maze becomes almost impossible to navigate.
And that is a thought that is going to stick with me for a long time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, look closely at the language being used by the institutions you trust, and never forget to watch out for those hidden doors in the maze. We'll catch you next time.